It is about to happen. There is an event coming that there'll be horns, there'll be whistles, there'll be all kinds of flutes, people wearing funny hats, all kinds of things that are going to happen on this particular day. There'll be all kinds of parties, there'll be all kinds of revelry, there'll be all kinds of drinking, and there'll be all kinds of things going on this particular day. There'll be parades, there'll be everything for this particular day. And a lot of people will be wearing green. So now you know what the event is that I'm talking about. There'll be possibly even a green river. A lot of times in Cleveland, they put food coloring or something into the river to turn it to green as it flows. The Cauga River flows into the Lake Erie. And then they have parades around that, and there'll be green beer to drink if you so choose to do. But you know, I really did not come to talk about St. Patrick's Day, March the 17th. But there's something coming on March the 17th. It just happens this year to coincide with St. Patrick's Day. It doesn't always, but it does this year. And it's listed on, if you have one of our little calendars that lists the holy days and so forth, it's listed on there. It's the first day of the sacred year. It's March the 17th this year. Now, it's not always on March the 17th. It's not always on St. Patrick's Day. Oftentimes, it's usually somewhere between the middle of March and the first week or so of April is when the sacred year begins. And again, it's not even really the sacred year specifically that I want to talk about either, but it's related. And the sacred year kicks off what I do want to talk about. And it's sort of what the starting point is, if you want to say. It's sort of the starter's gun in this particular period of events that are coming by. And of course, that is the holy days. Now, we can read, if you turn to Exodus, the 12th chapter, you can read a little bit about the first or the beginning of this year. Now, when I say beginning of the year, we probably think of the middle of winter in December, or January the 1st, the end of December, and then January the 1st being what we consider on our calendar that we use to be the first of the year. But in Exodus 12, in verse 1, it says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you." Now what this does, as I mentioned, it kicks off the cycle of meaning, so to speak. It kicks off the holy day period, or the holy day festivals, feasts, and commemorations. The Passover, which is first on the list, is not necessarily a feast or a holy day per se, but it is a period that begins the first events of these particular days. The first thing that we do, basically, and celebrate, acknowledge, or whatever, would be the Passover. And of course, the Passover has a long history that we have been reading about, and we do this every year, year after year after year. We do the same things, and we repeat the same things, and it's for a reason and for a purpose. The Holy Day season kicks off the plan of God, to show us the plan of God, and it, of course, ends with the last great day in the fall. Solomon said, and we won't go there, but in Ecclesiastes, the 3rd chapter, Solomon said, "There is a time and a season for everything under the sun." There's a time for throwing stones. There's a time for gathering stones. There's a time for laughing, and there's a time for mourning. There is a time, it even says a time for war and a time for peace. I know there is a time for war. I mean, we wish there wouldn't be, but there is a time when there are wars, or many wars. There's a lot more wars than there are years of peace. I forget how many wars or how many years of peace there have been in the last century or so, and it's not nearly up to the amount of days or times or months or whatever, or weeks of peace. I know that's a lot lesser time. So there's a time for everything, and as we approach this holy day season and the Passover, this has already been mentioned. It was mentioned last week. It was mentioned today in the sermonette a little bit. But there is a time to prepare. A time to prepare. That's the title of my message. A time to prepare. There's a time to prepare for the upcoming holy days, for the Passover. There is a time for us to prepare ourselves. That's both physically and mentally or spiritually. Both of those need preparation. Now, just briefly, I'll mention that as these holy days come up, like St. Patrick's Day, Satan seems to have a counterfeit for everything, whether it's the Sabbath, which he has his counterfeit being the next day. He said, you want a day of rest, I can do you one better. I'll go one better, and what I'll do, we'll have something. You can go to church if you want, or you can do something that seems religion or religious, and then you can sort of feel at peace, and you can go about your business and do whatever you want. We have the fall holy days. Well, he says, hey, look at this, I have something really glitzy. Most of his counterfeits are counterproductive, noisy celebrations to distract us from something that's really vital and valuable, and from lessons that God wants us to learn. New Year's Day is the same thing. And then we come to Easter in the spring. That's a counterfeit of the Passover. So the counterfeits are all there. It's all there to try to distract us, try to get us off track, to try to get us to see if we can be derailed and gotten off the path that we're on. And as I mentioned, the cycle of God's holy days starts with the Passover. And that's what we want to prepare for. And that's what the message is that I want to bring. Passover has always had, whether physical or spiritual, has always had preparation. It has had, we're in Exodus, the 12th chapter. Let's just read a little further. It says in verse 3 of Exodus 12, says, "Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let get together with a couple of your neighbors and at least make sure that you have enough to feed or enough lamb for any of those." Now, we always think of the Passover as lamb, but here in verse 5, it says that it could be a lamb or it could be a little kid of the goats. It could be either one if we wanted it to be. Either one would be fine. A little lamb, but it needs to be a yearling lamb or a yearling without blemish. It needs to be spotless. It needs to be perfect. Because after all, it in the future, it would represent Jesus Christ. So it would need to be perfect. There is a lesson in all of these things that we're doing, whether it's the physical or whether it's the spiritual. These things that we're going to talk about first are all pretty much physical, although there is a back story or a backdrop or a background of spiritual to all these things as well. It's not just physical. It has a spiritual component if you dig deep into it. And if we read all the way down through here, it tells them how to prepare it, how to kill the animal, how to prepare the meat, and so forth. Do not eat it raw, it says in verse 9, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, and so on. there was preparation, a significant amount. If you're thinking about it and you go out, you have a small farm. We have some people here that may have farm animals, maybe not so many in this congregation. But in our congregations, we have people with animals and farm animals and so forth. If you're thinking about it, you go out, you take a lamb or you take a little goat, and you bring it in. Now you have to provide a special place for it to keep it. You have to feed it. You have to water it. You have to make sure it stays healthy, because after all, this is to be a perfect example without blemish, a yearling. You bring it in. It takes work. It takes preparation. It takes activity to do that. The correlation, you can make many correlations. I'm not going to draw a lot of parallels between the physical and the spiritual in this regard. But you could, I'm sure, think of some if you were looking at it. But these are all mostly physical things that we do. It's always been like that, if you think about it. Christ, when he was here on earth with his disciples, when we read those stories, and our Sabbath focus had some of those scriptures listed there, and I would advise or recommend that you go ahead and read those scriptures that were listed, and others as well, whatever you normally do to get ready for and prepare for the Passover, that you would take the time to read, to study, to think about those things. And you will see immediately that preparation, whether it was physical or spiritual, was always needed and always done. Mark the 14th chapter, if you'd want to turn there. In the same incidents or the same things are also listed in Matthew the 26th chapter and in Luke the 22nd chapter. But Mark the 14th chapter is where we're going to begin, or look at, and then we are going to draw a little parallel between it and what we do. And just to get the backdrop a little bit, in verse 1 it says, after 2 days it was the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And so that's the time setting and the time frame that we can get. In verse 12 is where 12 to 16 is what we're really looking at, though. It says, now on the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, where do you want us to go and prepare, that you may eat the Passover? Now, one thing that we want to keep in mind as we're reading here, sometimes there are some vagaries in some of these scriptures that we read, and there are questions. In the spring around Passover, there are always questions that come up about when is the time, what do we do, those kind of things. And we see through a glass darkly. This was written to a culture that was different, or from a culture that was different than ours. It's written in a different language, a language we do not speak. Very few of us. There are some people that do, but I know most of us don't. And it was nearly 2,000 years ago. So there will be some things that are not as clear immediately. But with God's Spirit and so forth, we can pretty much determine what's going on and what the right time is. In fact, we're going to look at a little bit later, we're going to look at a point and a place where it makes it a little bit more clear that we're doing the right thing at the right time. But we'll get to that in a little bit. So, but he asked him, where do you want that we should go and prepare that you may eat the Passover? And he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, go into the city, and a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him. And probably he had prearranged this, or it's possible that it was just he knew what was going to happen, but I imagine it was prearranged so that he knew where to send him and when to send him and so on and so forth. But in verse 14, wherever he goes in, say to the master of the house, the teacher says, where's the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Then he will show you a large upper room furnished and prepared. There make ready for us. All about preparation. So his disciples went out and came into the city and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. Which, when you think about it, there was a lot of preparation for them to do. Even if the room was there, they had to make sure that there were tables there where they could have the Passover meal laid out. They had to make sure that the food was going to be there. They needed wine. They had to make sure that there was going to be wine. They had to make sure that there was water, because they, as we read in John, I think it's John 13, about the foot washing, that occurred at the same time. So there had to be water, there had to be towels, there had to be all those types of things had to be there, prepared and ready to go when Jesus came with his disciples to have the Passover meal, which he said he wanted to do. He was very anxious to do that one last time with his disciples before he was killed and returned to the Father. He wanted to do it because he wasn't going to do it again until he eats it with them in his kingdom. So this was important to him, but it had to be prepared. It had to be done ahead of time. It had to be gotten ready. It had to be to the point where they could come, sit down at the right time, and do it. We have to do the same thing. It's no different than what we do. We're going to be meeting in this room for the Passover, for those who are not traveling or going to be joining us. We're going to be here in this room, but we have to make sure with the management and the establishment here that we have a place to be, that we have it at the right time so that we have it reserved and we can come in and we can have the Passover here. Otherwise, we may get here and there'd be another event here, because we can't just assume that we're going to do it. We have to prepare for it. We have to come in and we have to set it up. I know many of you have been on setup for Passover, and you come here and sometimes you're surprised at how it needs to be redone, basically, so that the Passover will work here. We have to have a place in the back so that we can have the foot washing service. We have to have another place in the living room, or in the living room, the dining area out here, so we can have another set of foot washing. There are many things that you have to think about and prepare for physically for the Passover. It's not just it gets close to sunset and hey, let's go have the Passover. It doesn't really work like that. We have to arrange for the unleavened bread. We have to have a table up here with the unleavened bread on it. We have to fill the wine trays. They have to be all here and ready to go. We have to make sure and arrange so that we can have the wine. And it's not as easy as running out to the store sometimes getting wine, because we try to get a certain kind with a certain type of alcohol content, all of these things. It doesn't just happen. It takes preparation. And now, between now and then, is our time physically to prepare for all those things. Now, there is something that there is a preparation talked about in the Gospels that is overlooked largely because people do not observe these holy days, and they don't understand the sequence of things. They don't understand how this all fits together, and because they don't, this is overlooked, and there's an important element that is overlooked in this particular sequence. Mark the 15th chapter, since we're right here in Mark, about 2 pages forward. In Mark the 15th chapter, and this again, this relates, by the way, to not just the Passover, but it also does relate to the Passover. In verse 42 of Mark the 15th chapter, it says, "Now when evening had come, because it was the preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. Now here's where a lot of people stumble with that, because they don't go any further. They don't check into what this might be talking about. They say, oh, the day before the Sabbath, so that would be on Friday. It would be just on Friday. But so they assume then from that the crucifixion happened at that time, and then Christ was resurrected on Sunday morning. But they don't really do the math. They don't really look at this and consider all the scriptures, here a little and there a little. And that's how you put the whole puzzle together. Everything is not in one place. It's not all stated in one place. And it's not really my intention here now, today, to go through the 3 days and 3 nights and the scriptures that corroborate that and so on, the background and so forth. The fact that he was in the belly of the earth, like Jonah was in the belly of the whale or the fish that was prepared for him, for 3 days and 3 nights. That's really not the intention of what I'm bringing out here today. But this is part of the fact that people, when they don't observe these days and when they don't practice them, it's hard for them to understand. It's hard to understand how this all fits together. And the preparation day, it was an important key and an important part. Here in Mark, and it's also talked about in Luke and in Matthew, the Synoptic Gospels, but they don't give a lot of clarification. John clarifies it a little bit more. In John, the 19th chapter, John 19, we get a little more information. And I just to see what the commentaries say about it, I looked through some commentaries on all of these verses about the preparation day. And they all pretty much without fail either overlook them, ignore them, or gloss right by them without really giving any in-depth information. There are a few that do, but not very many. Most of them just assume, as most ordinary people reading this do, that this is a preparation day, it's a Friday, and so forth, and then they gloss right over and go right on. But John gives a little bit more information. There are 2 verses that bookend each other, that bookend Christ's crucifixion in John the 19th chapter here that we're going to read, that we're going to look at. And the first one is in verse 14. Here he clarifies it just a little bit, because he said, now it was the preparation day of the Passover. It wasn't just an ordinary preparation day. It was the preparation day of the Passover. And I'm mentioning all this because I want to bring out a little bit of a point about the preparation day and about preparation. In verse 14, then it goes on and it goes down through the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, on through in after verse 14 down through all the way into the 30th verse of John 19, where it says that Christ said, it is finished, and bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. But then in verse 31, it clinches, puts a capstone on it, because it says, therefore, because it was the preparation day, that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day. It wasn't just your ordinary everyday weekly Sabbath. It was a high day. It was a day that was something else was going on. Of course, we know that it was the first day of unleavened bread, and Jewish law forbade the bodies remaining on the cross, or even in hanging or whatever execution, remaining them to be there till sundown, after sundown of that day. So they would have had to take him down. And that's why John clarifies this a little bit, that it was a preparation day for that Sabbath. Well, the Sabbath was a high day. Now, the preparation day It's in caps in my New King James Bible, but it was not necessarily a commanded day as such. There are indications that it is necessary and that it's valid, but it was probably a little bit more of a tradition, and there are different traditions. Christ said that they have vain traditions which nullify the commandments. Well, this would not have been in that vein. This would have been a tradition that was actually positive and in keeping with God's commandments. We might remember there was all the way back to when the first when the children of Israel had just come out of Egypt, and they were in the wilderness, and right away they started grumbling and complaining. Now, I know they were hungry, and I know we wouldn't do that, but they did. And they were complaining that we wish you had left us in Egypt because we could have, you brought us out here to kill us of hunger. And, of course, we know the story. We'll go back there, and it's in Exodus, the 16th chapter. We'll just look at something real quick. It's just an example. It doesn't talk about the preparation day or preparing specifically, but it relates to preparing. In chapter 16, in verse 4, after they had said, you're going to kill us here, the whole assembly, with hunger, wish we had stayed in Egypt where we had the pots of meat and we ate bread to the full. We were in good shape, in other words, when we were in Egypt. That is, if you like to be slaves and if you don't like any freedom or any of your own rights, you were in good shape. If you can't keep the Sabbath and so forth, because the Sabbath was known before Sinai. The Sabbath was known before Abraham knew about God's law, and he kept God's law. And he was obedient to it. So it was known before the children of Israel went into Egypt. Joseph went there, and then his whole family came. And before that, the Sabbath was already known to some people, a small group of people probably, but nonetheless it was known. So it said in verse 4, then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain quota every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. And it shall be, and here's what we're coming to, verse 5, it shall be on the 6th day that they shall prepare what they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. And then we're going to go on to verse 22, and we'll read from 22 to 30. And here's where the problems come in. So it was on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread. Well, let's go back to verse 21. So they gathered it every morning, every man according to his need, and when the sun became hot, it melted. Now, this was not like some kind of a welfare program. They couldn't stay in bed till noon and still be fed. They had to get up, and they had to do something. They were going to get this, but they had to get up early, because when the sun came out, it was gone. It dissolved like snow does in the sun. And they wouldn't have had any if they didn't get out early and get it. They had to do something for it. And so it was in verse 22, on the 6th day that they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one, and all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. Then he said, this is what the Lord has said, tomorrow is a Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil. In other words, do what you can today in preparation. This is a preparation day. Just like we have a preparation for the Passover. This is preparation for the Sabbath. But it also would have applied to the first day of unleavened bread, and the place where we read in Mark and in John. It would also have applied there. and lay up for yourselves all that remains to be kept until morning. Because before, what they had done, some of them thought, well, I'll just be wise and I'll just be smart. I'll get twice as much, then I won't have to get up early and get it tomorrow. Didn't work. It raised a stink, as you would say. Worms were in it, and it smelled really bad. So they have discovered that wouldn't work. So here they are getting twice as much on the day before the Sabbath. So they laid it up until morning, as Moses commanded, and it didn't smell bad, didn't stink, nor were there any worms in it. And Moses said, "Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there shall be none." Now it happened, imagine this. It happened that some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather it, but those people went hungry because there was none there. And then he said, "How long will you refuse to keep my commandments?" It was a test. And then the people rested on the seventh day. And I imagine after about that first Sabbath, they wised up and they realized this ain't going to happen tomorrow. We better prepare on Friday. It's the same thing with the Passover. We have an obligation to prepare for the Passover before it arrives. We have an obligation to look at things before they arrive and before it's upon us. And we'll get to that in just a second. But the preparation day, he said, boil what you want, cook the meat that you can, do all these things. It's similar. We do the same thing. We gas up our car. Once in a while we forget. I know I do. We buy the food we need or get the food we need, prepare as much as we can the day before so we don't have to do it on the Sabbath, those kind of things. They were doing the same thing, except they were not going to have any food the next day unless they prepared it on the day before. But these are all physical things. It's not the spiritual preparation that we really are looking at for. They're important. We have to be ready for the Passover physically when it comes. Otherwise, we can't have the Passover, as I mentioned, with the unleavened bread and with the wine. And we'll turn back. I'll give you a head start. We're going to 1 Corinthians 11, which is probably where you thought we were going. 1 Corinthians 11. But there's been preparation, physical and spiritual, for a long time. We have been obligated to do that. We've been asked to do that for a long time. The book of 1 Corinthians, as we probably know if we've been around for any length of time, has been a book that has been associated with the Passover and the days of unleavened bread for many years. We've realized that because of all the things. Chapter 5, for example, talks about our Passover lamb. And it talks about a little leaven leavening the whole lump. All those kind of things. We've known this for many, many years. It's not something new to us. So Paul, as you might imagine, had a little bit more specific information about the Passover in chapter 11. In chapter 11, and here's where we know, one of the ways and one of the reasons we know that what we're doing at the time we're doing, the way we're doing, is the right thing. Because it so lays it out right here. We don't have to get sidetracked and worried so much about, sometimes we get so sidetracked about the minutiae and the little details that we miss the main major point of the Passover. It can easily happen. But in verse 23, he says, "I received of the Lord that which I also delivered to you." So in other words, what I am telling you here is what I got from Jesus Christ himself, and I'm delivering it to you so you can do the same thing, so we can do the same thing here. what I am telling you, I'm delivering to you for you and us to do also. For I delivered from the Lord that which I also I received from the Lord, that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. So that pretty much clarifies the time frame. And then he said what they did. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, "Take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same manner he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." Now, saying as often as you drink it doesn't give us license to do it whenever we want. Something we do as a memorial and in remembrance is done usually on the annual event of that day. I don't celebrate my birthday every week or every month or every quarter. I celebrate it on its anniversary. I try not to celebrate them anymore because there's just been too many of them. But at any rate, that's how memorials are done. They're done at the time when it took place annually. For as often, 26, for as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. Therefore, and here's where we start to really get to the heart of the matter. Therefore, of what I want to bring out here in just the next few minutes that we have left. Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord. But, let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. So there is a preparation that is expected of us. There's an examination that we should be doing at this period of time. This is a time to prepare for the Passover. This is the time to prepare for the Passover, because once we get there, then we're doing we continue till we have taken the Passover to examine ourselves. But now this gives us an opportunity in advance to do a more thorough and a more complete evaluation and examination of ourselves. This particular word, and I don't speak Greek, so I won't try to pronounce it, but it's Strong's number 1381. It means to prove, to test, to discern, or to try. To try something. We're doing look at a couple of just quick examples of this, but it means to look at ourselves in a discriminating way, to see where we're at, to take stock of ourselves, so to speak. Luke, the 14th chapter, there is just a quick recounting of this, or a quick example of this in verse 19. A certain man had given a great supper, and he'd invited a bunch of people, and when it was time, he sent out his servants to tell them, "Hey, come on in, it's time to eat." But they all started making excuses. "I just got married. I just bought some ground, and I have to go check it out." In verse 19, another man said, "I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm going to test them. I ask to be excused." In other words, he's going to examine them. Now, if we buy a new car and we want to examine it or test it, we go, we drive it, we put it through the paces, we see if it has any power, if it, maybe we spin the wheels a little bit and, as they say, lay some rubber or whatever to see if this car is a good one, or if this car will get out of its own way. We check it out. We put it through the paces, so to speak. We test it. We try it. I think the King James might say that he is proving it, the regular King James, this is the New King James, that I am proving my car, or in this case, these oxen. He wants to see if they're worth their salt, to see if they will actually work in the fields. I've never driven oxen, but I've always wanted to. I did a lot of horses, but no oxen. But oxen are pretty powerful if they work right and work together. So that's what he was trying to do. There's another, just about a page or two back in chapter 12 of Luke in verse 56, just one page back. He's talking about to the multitudes here, the crowds, probably the Pharisees, that he said, you can see, you say in the morning, or in the evening, it's going to be a nice day tomorrow because the sky, the sunset's red. Or in the morning when the sun comes up, you say, going to be a bad day today and it's going to rain or whatever because it's red in the morning. There's a little rhyme that goes with it, which I never can quite get right, so I won't try it, but most of you probably know it. And then in verse 56, he says, hypocrites, you can discern the face of the sky and of the earth, but how is it that you do not discern the time? In other words, you can examine, you can look, you can figure out what's the weather's going to be right, but you can't discern. And I'm just want to, it's the same word, number 1381 in the Greek from Strong's, and it's rendered here, or it's translated as discern here. Means to look at it, to look at something critically. This is a reminder and an opportunity for us to examine ourselves, to look at ourselves, to test ourselves, to try ourselves. Companies take, and I know we have some people that own companies, every year they take inventories. Because if they don't take inventory, they don't know where they're at. If you don't have records and inventories and measurements by which you can measure things, then it's just like shadow boxing, or it's just like trying to exercise in a vacuum because there's no resistance. You don't know where you're at. You have no idea what you're at. But the companies, like I say, they count all their hard goods to see what they have. They look at their cash on hand. They look at their investments. They reconcile payables and receivables to see if the receivables and the payables, how that works up and how their cash flow is. And they also, keep, if they want to make plans to move forward and to get better, they have to take inventory and stock of where they're at. That's what we have to do. Every year, we have this opportunity during the Passover season to take stock and take inventory of what we are, of where we are in our growth. Expositor's Bible commentary on this particular verse, 1 Corinthians 11:28, says about examining. To examine oneself is to put oneself to the test as to attitude of his heart, his outward conduct, and his understanding of the Passover supper. How well do we understand it? What attitude do we have towards it? And what is our outward conduct like? That's what it means to examine ourselves. It's to look at ourselves critically and see where we are. See, hey, should we make an adjustment here? Should we correct course here? What can we do to get better? Are we growing? Are we continuing to grow in grace and knowledge? There is a quick guide that we can use in this regard. It's in 2 Peter. We can look at it, 2 Peter. It's in the first chapter of 2 Peter. It's something that we can use to measure ourselves against. Now, there are other places also in Galatians and Ephesians where the fruits of the Spirit are listed and so on, that we can also use to measure ourselves by. But we're going to look at 2 Peter and in chapter 1. 2 Peter 1. If I can get there. This Peter is writing here to brethren. He's writing to the church. He's not writing to necessarily the Gentiles or outsiders or whatever. In this particular letter, it says in verse 1, Simon Peter, a bondservant and apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who have obtained like precious faith with us, the righteousness of our God and Savior, Jesus Christ. Goes on to say, grace and peace be multiplied to you in the knowledge of God and of Jesus Christ our Lord, as his divine power has given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us by glory and virtue. So he's saying all these things, setting up the little the key points that he's going to make that we can use to sort of gauge where we're at, and we can use as a stepping stone to greater achievement, especially as we examine ourselves in light of the upcoming Passover season. He says in verse 4, by which have been given to us exceedingly great and precious promises, that through these things, or these, you may be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption, which is the depravity, as it says in the margin, that is in the world through lust. And if we've been following the news lately and the shootings that are going on and some of the other things, parents killing their children, children killing their parents, all kinds of evil things that have been going on, and we can sure relate to what he's saying to this here about the depravity that is going on in the world that's around us through lust. But here's where we're going. In verse 5, also for this very reason, giving all diligence, that's in light of what he just said, add to your faith. Now faith is pretty much the first thing that we need to have if we're going to accept the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on our behalf. And this really, as we'll see at the end, actually has a tie-in to the Passover. But also for this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith. And our faith being our belief, the things that we're sure of. It says faith, what does he say in Hebrew? That faith is the evidence of things not seen, the things hoped for. And that's what faith is. It's what we believe and what we have come to believe, and we have to get to that point first. And then add to your faith virtue, which is moral excellence. It's our foundational beliefs, the moral excellence that we won't compromise, the things we won't compromise because we know that they're wrong. Yes, in weakness, we do compromise them, unfortunately, at times. And God forgives us. But we can't use that as a license to continue to sin and continue to do the things that are wrong. Moral excellence is the foundation of doing the right things, of righteousness. And then add to that knowledge. We continue, as is said in another place, to grow in grace and knowledge. Continue that particular growth. Now, we can look at these things, and we can look at them in ourselves, and we can see where are we on that scale. Are we better than we were last year? This is an opportunity for us to every year to evaluate and examine ourselves and to see, to make sure we're growing. Are we gaining? Are we getting better? Are we becoming more godlike? And so on. Knowledge can help us do that. If we had this next attribute, I dare say that we could overcome almost anything. And that is, he says, add to knowledge self-control. If we had self-control, if I had self-control, perfect self-control, total self-control, there is almost nothing spiritual that I couldn't do. I could be righteous. You could be totally righteous if you had perfect and complete self-control. It's hard to have. We're still probably not there. I know I'm not. I don't want to speak for you, but I am not there yet. But I'm working towards it. I keep trying to become more or have more self-control. Then to self-control, perseverance, which really is patience. And patience is another one of those things that we'd like to have right now, but that's not how patience works. Patience takes time. We have to continue to build on it and continue to grow in patience. Patience, we grow when we have trials, tribulations. When we are tested, we develop patience because we continue to endure and we build on patience little by little, and we keep growing in that same fashion. Then to perseverance, godliness, becoming more like Jesus Christ, developing the mind of Jesus Christ, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Jesus Christ. We can measure ourselves. We can look at that and we can say, am I getting better at that year by year? Am I better at that, or do I still need to continually make the effort or make more of an effort to become that way? More godliness, and then the godliness, brotherly kindness. And brotherly kindness, we got that, the thank you note for exemplifying brotherly kindness. That's just one way, but there are many ways that is done. Brotherly kindness, being kind to our brothers and sisters, and that, as we could see from the parable of the Good Samaritan, and who's your neighbor, everybody fits into that category. It's not just our brothers in the church or our physical brothers and sisters. It's everybody. We want to show brotherly kindness and kindness of heart, tenderheartedness to everyone, not just those who are here with us, but everyone else as well, whether it's at work, at the grocery store, on the street when we'd like to run over that guy that cut us off or whatever. You know, it's everybody all the time. And then to brotherly kindness, the clincher, love, outgoing concern for others. Do unto others as you would like to have done unto you. We shall love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, and with all our mind, and our neighbor as ourself. That's love. That is love, and that's what he said here, and it's stated in many different ways throughout the Gospels and Paul's writings and throughout the New Testament and in the Old Testament, because those commandments to love God and to love your neighbor come from our quotes from the Old Testament. For if these things, in verse 8, if these things are yours and abound, you will be neither barren, and I like sort of what the margin says. It says you will be neither useless, or you'll be neither barren nor unfruitful in the knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. For he who lacks these things is short-sighted even to blindness, and has forgotten that he was cleansed from his sins. Passover reflects on that we're cleansed from our sins. It's that Christ's death cleansing us from our sins, forgiveness of sins. Therefore, brethren, be even more diligent to make your calling and election sure. For if you do these things, if we do these things that he stated here, we examine ourselves and we measure up where are we, and we continue to grow and we strive to do these things. He said, if you do these things, you will never stumble. The King James says we will never fail. We will always succeed. We will always be moving forward. We will always continue to grow. And every year we can take these guidelines, these steps, and we can continue step by step to get higher and higher on that ladder of overcoming and developing in our Christian life. Passover, just in recapping a little bit, Passover is Thursday night, the 29th. Now, it's at sunset, which begins the evening before, which is at sunset on the 29th. Passover is listed on our calendar as the 30th. So don't show up here on the 30th, though, because it's the night before at sunset, right here in this building. But now is the time to prepare for it. It's the time to take stock of where we are. It's the time to look at ourselves in light of some of these things that we've read and some of the other things that we can read, whether it's in Ephesians or Galatians and so forth, the helmet of salvation, the fruits of the Spirit, and all those kind of scriptures. There are lots of places that we can go and see how, as we examine ourselves, do I measure up to that particular standard, to that level of Christianity, to that level of obedience to God and Jesus Christ. There's a physical preparation that we have to do as we prepare for the Passover. But there's also that mental and that physical preparation, that spiritual preparation that needs to take place every year. We're asked to do that. It's a great opportunity because it reminds us every year. We go along, I know, especially in the wintertime, maybe when there are no holy days to remind us of it, we go along and we sort of can get lulled to sleep almost a little bit. But when the holy days come, it wakes us up again and it gets us going, and we have that opportunity to once again. We can do it all the time, but sometimes we just need that little bit of a reminder to make sure that we do it. Do we need, as we look at ourselves, to make adjustments, course corrections? Do we need to be making some changes in our life? Well, this gives us the opportunity to look at it and do it. Most New Year's, we talked about New Year's to begin with. Most New Year's resolutions fail or are long forgotten within the first month. They don't last very long. I want to lose some weight, or I want to do this, I want to do that, but there's a big dinner tomorrow, so I'll put it off till after that. I don't want to have to worry about not eating when I have this opportunity to eat in this big dinner. And then the next thing we know, some people have, maybe I do, have the sort of the theory, never put off till tomorrow what you can put off indefinitely. And that's what probably a lot of people do. I know I sometimes feel like that about myself, but we shouldn't be that way. We have, though, a greater opportunity probably than anybody or most anybody else to overcome, to grow as we examine ourselves. Why do I say that? Because we have God's Spirit in us that strengthens us and helps us. We have God's church, which can encourage and help us and support us as we do grow or try to grow and overcome. And we have God's Word to show us the way. Not everybody has that, but we do. The thing for us to do as we examine ourselves is to take advantage of this opportunity to grow in grace and knowledge.